The morning of June 19, 1944, 350 miles west of Guam, in the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Taiho. Around him, spread across 40 miles of ocean, sail 8 more Japanese carriers, the last operational fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 430 aircraft crowd their decks and hangars. This is Japan's final bid for the decisive naval battle they have dreamed of since the war began. Ozawa believes he holds a crucial advantage. His aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, the Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers, can strike from 300 miles away. American aircraft, he knows from intelligence reports, can reach only 200 miles, perhaps 250 at most. He will hit them before they can hit back. It is the fundamental principle of carrier warfare. Strike first, strike hard, strike decisively. Something Ozawa does not know, something his intelligence officers have failed to grasp, despite months of reports filtering back from reconnaissance aircraft and captured documents. Over the horizon, steaming toward him at 30 knots, are 15 American carriers. 6 of them are Essex-class fleet carriers ships that have entered service in the past 18 months. Ships that operate under principles so fundamentally different from Japanese carrier doctrine that Ozawa's staff cannot conceptualize what they are about to face. The question is not whether the Americans have more carriers. Ozawa knows they do. The question is not whether American aircraft are superior. He knows they are. The question, the one that will determine everything in the next 48 hours, is this. How quickly can a carrier put aircraft into the sky? How many sorties can it launch in an hour? How long can it sustain that tempo? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answers Ozawa carries in his head are based on Japanese carrier operations. They are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Because while Japanese doctrine requires 40 minutes to spot aircraft on deck and another 20 minutes to warm engines before launch, the Essex-class carriers waiting over the horizon can launch more than 100 aircraft in less than an hour. Not once, not as a desperate emergency measure, but repeatedly, sustainably, throughout an entire day of combat operations. This is not the story of superior technology or braver pilots. This is the story of 2 completely different philosophies of carrier warfare and how one was designed to win battles while the other was designed to win wars. It is the story of the hidden revolution that happened on American flight decks between 1942 and 1944, a revolution so profound that the Japanese could not believe it even when they saw it with their own eyes. To understand what happened in the Philippine Sea, we must go back 3 years, to when the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed what historians consider the most advanced carrier aviation doctrine in the world. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 precisely coordinated waves against Pearl Harbor. The attack was a masterpiece of carrier operations. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers worked in integrated formations. Each carrier's air group knew its exact target, its approach route, its timing. The coordination was flawless. The execution was devastating. This was the product of a decade of refinement. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been operating carriers since the 1920s, and by 1941 they had developed carrier doctrine into an art form. Their concept was called Kido, Butai, the mobile striking force, and it was built around a principle of massed carrier operations. Instead of dispersing carriers across the fleet, Japan concentrated them into divisions. Carrier Division 1, Akagi and Kaga. Carrier Division 2, Hiryu and Soryu. Carrier Division 5, Shokaku and Zuikaku. They launched integrated strikes where aircraft from multiple carriers formed single attack formations. A Zero fighter from Akagi would escort a dive bomber from Kaga, attacking the same target as a torpedo bomber from Soryu. The complexity was extraordinary. The results were undeniable. But this level of coordination came at a cost measured in time. Japanese carrier design reflected this doctrine. The Akagi, converted from a battlecruiser, had been extensively rebuilt in the 1930s. The Shokaku-class carriers, completed in 1941, represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design. They were fast 34 knots. They were well armed. They carried 70 to 84 aircraft, depending on configuration. And they featured 2 hangar decks, an upper and a lower, completely enclosed within the hull. This enclosed hangar design was deliberate. It protected aircraft from Pacific weather. It provided space for extensive workshops where mechanics could repair and maintain aircraft away from the corrosive salt air. It allowed for ammunition and fuel storage close to the aircraft they would service. But enclosed hangars created a fundamental operational constraint. Aircraft engines could not be warmed up inside them. The carbon monoxide would build up in the enclosed space, poisoning the crews. The heat from dozens of radial engines would create dangerous temperatures in spaces filled with aviation gasoline vapor. So, Japanese procedure required that aircraft be prepared in the hangar fueled, armed, inspected, then brought topside to the flight deck for engine start. Only then could pilots warm their engines for the 5 to 15 minutes necessary before takeoff. Only then could the launch sequence begin. The process was methodical. Spotting aircraft on deck, positioning them with proper spacing and orientation for launch, required approximately 40 minutes on a Japanese fleet carrier. Engineers had calculated the minimum safe spacing between aircraft. Too close, and one engine fire could spread to multiple planes. Too far apart, and you could not fit enough aircraft on deck for a meaningful strike. 40 minutes to spot. 20 minutes for engine warm-up. Time to coordinate between multiple carriers in the division. From the decision to launch to the first aircraft leaving the deck, 60 to 75 minutes under ideal conditions. This was not considered a flaw. This was standard operating procedure. This was the price of launching coordinated, devastating strikes that could cripple enemy carriers with a single blow. And in the first 6 months of the war, it worked perfectly. At Pearl Harbor, the carriers launched from 230 miles away, well outside American search range. At Ceylon, they struck British bases with impunity. At Darwin, they devastated an Australian port. The doctrine was validated with every victory. But there was a different philosophy developing on the other side of the Pacific. American carrier doctrine in 1941 was less refined than Japan's, but it was built on different assumptions. The United States Navy had been experimenting with carriers since the 1920s, when the collier Jupiter was converted into the USS Langley. By the late 1930s, the Yorktown-class carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet represented American thinking about carrier warfare. American carriers had a single hangar deck, not 2. But this hangar was different from Japanese designs in a crucial way. It was open-sided. Metal rolling screens could be opened to expose the hangar to the elements. Aircraft engines could be warmed up on the hangar deck. Aviation fuel could be pumped directly from storage to flight deck fueling stations. More importantly, American doctrine emphasized something called the deck load strike, the concept of launching as many aircraft as possible, as rapidly as possible, by pre-positioning them on the flight deck itself. While Japanese carriers kept most aircraft in the hangar until needed, American carriers pioneered the deck park, permanently positioning aircraft on the flight deck with wings folded, ready for immediate launch. This created its own problems. Aircraft on deck were exposed to weather. Salt spray corroded metal. High seas could wash planes overboard. But it saved time, precious minutes that could mean the difference between striking first and being struck. The Yorktown-class carriers could launch 60 to 75 aircraft in a deck-load strike. It wasn't as elegant as Japanese coordinated operations. There was less time for briefing, less coordination between different aircraft types, but it was faster. Still, by early 1942, the Americans knew the Yorktown design wasn't enough. They had 3 Yorktown-class carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 6 fleet carriers, plus several light carriers. The numbers weren't in America's favor. Then came Midway. On June 4, 1942, the limitations of Japanese carrier doctrine became devastatingly apparent. 4 Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu approached Midway Island with 108 aircraft spotted on their decks for a strike against American forces. The strike launched. It was executed perfectly. But while those carriers' decks were empty, waiting for the strike to return, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found them. The Japanese carriers had aircraft in their hangars, aircraft that had been intended for a second strike against American carriers, once they were located. These aircraft were fueled, many were armed, they were in enclosed hangars surrounded by workshops, storerooms, and crew spaces. When American bombs penetrated the flight decks, the enclosed hangars became ovens. Aviation gasoline ignited, bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the heat. Fire spread through passageways that connected one enclosed space to another. Within minutes, 3 carriers were burning uncontrollably. By evening, all 4 were lost. The battle demonstrated something crucial. In carrier warfare, speed of operations could matter more than perfection of execution. The Japanese had launched flawless strikes, but they could not rearm and relaunch fast enough to deal with the threat they faced. American naval planners absorbed this lesson, and they had already begun building the ships that would apply it. In May 1938, Congress passed the Naval Expansion Act. For the first time since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, the United States was free to build carriers without tonnage restrictions. Japan had abandoned the treaty system in 1936, and the geopolitical reality was clear. War was coming. The question was, what to build? The Yorktown class had proven effective, but naval architects wanted to incorporate lessons from nearly 2 decades of carrier operations. More importantly, they wanted to design a carrier specifically optimized for the emerging American doctrine of high-tempo, sustained operations. Design work began in earnest in 1939. Commander Leslie Keenisken at the Bureau of Ships coordinated input from aviators, ship drivers, catapult specialists, and aircraft handlers. They had one overarching requirement. The new carrier must be able to operate 90 aircraft and launch them faster than any carrier in the world. The resulting design was CV-9, USS Essex. At 27,100 tons standard displacement, she was 40% heavier than the Yorktown class. She was 872 feet long, 60 feet longer than her predecessors. Her flight deck was wider. Her hangar was taller, longer, and completely open on the sides. But size wasn't the revolution. The revolution was in the details of how aircraft would move through the ship. Essex had 3 elevators. 2 were on the center line, as in previous carriers. But the 3rd was positioned on the deck edge, the port side of the ship, outside the hull structure. This deck edge elevator was revolutionary. When it operated, it didn't block any portion of the flight deck. Aircraft could be launching forward while the elevator brought planes up from the hangar aft. Operations that had to be sequential on Japanese carriers could be simultaneous on the Essex. The hangar itself was designed for flow. It was divided into sections by the elevators, but these sections were sized to hold exactly 1 squadron's worth of aircraft. A fighter squadron could occupy the forward section, with their aircraft being brought up via the forward centerline elevator. A dive bomber squadron could occupy the middle section, using the aft centerline elevator. A torpedo squadron could occupy the aft section, using the deck edge elevator. 3 squadrons could be moving to the flight deck simultaneously. The 4th squadron was already on deck, permanently parked with wings folded, forming the deck park that would launch first. The fuel system was designed for speed. Essex carried 240,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, vastly more than previous carriers. But more important than quantity was delivery. Fuel lines ran directly to 24 fueling stations on the flight deck. Aircraft could be fueled on deck while being armed, while being inspected, while being positioned for launch. Every operation that could be parallelized was parallelized. The machinery was designed for sustained high-speed operations. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers fed, steam to 4 Westinghouse turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. This pushed Essex to 33 knots, fast enough to generate wind over deck for heavily loaded aircraft, fast enough to close with the enemy or withdraw if necessary, fast enough to maintain that speed hour after hour without mechanical strain. And the ship was designed to keep fighting even when damaged. The hangar deck was armoured 2.5 inches of special treatment steel that could stop a 500-pound bomb. The flight deck was wooden planking over light steel, deliberately unarmoured. This seemed counterintuitive. Wouldn't you want to armour the flight deck? No, because an armoured flight deck added weight high in the ship, limiting how many aircraft you could carry. And an armoured flight deck would cause bombs to detonate on the deck surface, where the blast and fire would destroy every aircraft spotted topside. The Essex philosophy was different. Let small bombs pass through the wooden flight deck. They would detonate below, in the armoured hangar deck. Damage would be contained, and wooden planking could be rapidly repaired by ship's carpenters. Within hours, even severe deck damage could be patched well enough to resume flight operations. This was the philosophy built into every inch of the Essex design. Sustained operations matter more than invulnerability. Speed of repair matters more than preventing damage. Getting aircraft into the air matters more than perfection of coordination. The first Essex-class carrier, CV-9 USS Essex, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941. She was launched July 31, 1942. She commissioned December 31, 1942, 15 months, from keel laying to commissioning. This was extraordinarily fast for a carrier of her size, but Essex was just the beginning. By the time she commissioned, 5 more hulls were already under construction. The United States was about to demonstrate something the Japanese had not anticipated. Industrial warfare applied to carrier construction. The keel of USS Lexington, CV-16, was laid down September 15, 1942. The keel of USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, followed on September 15, 1941. USS Yorktown, CV-10, on December 1, 1941. USS Intrepid, CV-11, on December 1, 1941. USS Hornet, CV-12, on August 3, 1942. USS Franklin, CV-13, on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. The construction schedule was staggering. Essex-class carriers were being completed at a rate of 1 every 2 months. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers had joined the fleet. By mid-1944, 14 were in service. The final count would reach 17 carriers commissioned before war's end, with 7 more completed by 1950. This was mass production, applied to capital ships. Standardization was key. Every Essex-class carrier used the same propulsion system, the same elevator design, the same catapult arrangement, the same aircraft handling equipment. Parts were interchangeable between ships. Crews trained on one Essex could transfer to another and find everything in the same location. Air groups could rotate between carriers without relearning deck procedures. But the ships themselves were only half the revolution. The other half was happening on their flight decks, a revolution in operational tempo that would prove more devastating to Japan than any single weapons system. By late 1943, when Essex-class carriers began arriving in the Pacific in numbers, American flight deck operations had evolved into something unprecedented. The transformation was driven by experience, bitter experience purchased at Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, where the margin between victory and disaster was measured in minutes. The Americans had learned that in carrier warfare, the side that could put more aircraft in the air faster would win. Not better aircraft, not more skilled pilots. More aircraft, faster. Volume and tempo overwhelmed quality and coordination, so they developed procedures to maximize both. The techniques were refined through endless practice, through analysis of every launch operation, through incorporation of lessons from combat. What emerged was a system of flight deck choreography that treated the carrier not as a precision instrument, but as a factory whose product was combat sorties and whose efficiency was measured in aircraft launched per hour. The deck park became permanent. On an Essex-class carrier operating in combat, 30 to 40 aircraft would be permanently positioned on the flight deck, wings folded, ready for immediate launch. These were typically fighters, Grumman F-6F Hellcats, positioned forward and along the port side of the deck. They could be launched within minutes of the order. Behind them, in the aft section of the flight deck, would be the bombers initially Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, later replaced by Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The heaviest aircraft were always positioned furthest aft, where they would have the longest takeoff run. This permanent deck park meant the first strike wave was already in position, but what about the second wave? This was where the Essex design proved revolutionary. While the first wave launched, the second wave was already moving up from the hangar. The 3 elevators operated in sequence. The deck-edge elevator would bring up the first section of aircraft, say, a division of 4 fighters. These would be positioned on the port side, wings still folded. Before they reached the flight deck, the aft centerline elevator was already bringing up the next group dive bombers. They would be rolled aft and spotted for launch. The forward centerline elevator would bring up the final group, more fighters or torpedo bombers. This wasn't sequential. This was simultaneous. All 3 elevators operate at once. Flight deck crews, organized into specific teams with specific responsibilities, would fold out wings, connect fuel lines, arm weapons, position aircraft, all while the deck ahead was still launching the first wave. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The timing was precise. An Essex-class carrier with a well-trained deck crew could spot 60 aircraft on the flight deck in 25 to 30 minutes. Compare this to the 40 minutes required on Japanese carriers, and the difference seems modest. But that's just spotting. The real difference was in the total cycle time. Japanese procedure required spotting, then engine warm-up on deck, then launch. Sequential operations. American procedure allowed engines to be warmed in the hangar, with aircraft moving to the flight deck already ready to launch. Parallel operations. And American procedure allowed fueling and arming on the flight deck, while Japanese procedure required these operations to be completed in the hangar before moving topside. The cumulative effect was dramatic. An Essex-class carrier could complete a full deck load launch, 60 to 90 aircraft, in 30 to 40 minutes from the order to launch. Under combat conditions, with crews at peak efficiency, some Essex carriers achieved full deck load launches in 25 minutes. But launching was only half the operation. The Americans also revolutionized aircraft recovery. Japanese carriers had no crash barriers. If an aircraft landed damaged or failed to catch an arresting wire, it would roll forward into aircraft spotted ahead, potentially destroying multiple planes. So, Japanese procedure required the deck to be completely clear before landing operations began. Each aircraft that landed had to be immediately struck below to the hangar before the next aircraft could land. This created a bottleneck. Recovery rates were slow. American carriers installed crash barriers, heavy nylon nets that could be raised hydraulically. If an aircraft missed all the arresting wires, the barrier would stop it before it reached the forward deck park. This meant multiple aircraft could land before any had to be moved. American carriers could recover aircraft at twice the rate of Japanese carriers. The numbers tell the story. A Japanese fleet carrier required approximately 8 to 10 minutes per aircraft for recovery operations. An American carrier required 4 to 5 minutes per aircraft. For a strike of 50 aircraft returning to the carrier, this was the difference between an hour and a half versus 3 hours for complete recovery. And during that recovery time, the American carrier could still be preparing another strike in the hangar below. The cumulative effect of these improvements, deck park, multiple elevators, parallel operations, fast recovery, was a revolution in sortie generation. A sortie is one aircraft launched on one mission. It is the fundamental unit of carrier combat power. The more sorties a carrier can generate per day, the more combat power it projects. Japanese carriers in 1944, operating under their established doctrine, could generate approximately 100 to 120 sorties per day. This included combat air patrol, strike operations, and search missions. It was a respectable number. It represented professional, efficient operations. Essex-class carriers, by mid-1944, were routinely generating 180 to 200 sorties per day. In surge operations during major battles, they could generate 220 to 250 sorties in a single day. This was not a marginal improvement. This was a transformation in the fundamental tempo of carrier warfare, and it was about to be demonstrated in the most decisive carrier battle of the war. By early June 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. American forces had swept through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and were now assaulting the Marianas Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These islands were only 1,300 miles from Tokyo. If they fell, they would provide bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers that could reach the Japanese home islands. For Japan, the Marianas had to be held. For the first time since Midway, the combined fleet committed its remaining carrier strength to battle. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, activated Operation Eigo, the plan for the decisive fleet engagement that Japanese doctrine had always envisioned. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet 9 carriers with 430 aircraft. He knew American carrier strength was greater. Intelligence reported 15 American carriers in the area, but Ozawa believed he had advantages that would compensate. First, his aircraft had a longer range. Japanese fighters and bombers could strike from 300 miles. American aircraft could reach perhaps 250 miles at most. Ozawa could hit the Americans before they could hit him. Second, he could use land bases in the Marianas to refuel and rearm his aircraft. They could strike the American fleet, land on Guam, refuel, and strike again on the return flight. This, shuttle bombing, would double his effective striking power. Third, Japanese pilots were still trained in the doctrine that had proven so effective at Pearl Harbor: coordinated mass strikes that would overwhelm American defenses with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. What Ozawa did not know, what his intelligence staff had failed to grasp, was that the American carriers waiting for him operated under completely different principles. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, had evolved doctrine and tactics that would have seemed operationally impossible by Japanese standards. American carriers no longer waited to detect the enemy before launching aircraft. They launched continuously. Combat air patrol fighters were maintained aloft in layers, some at 15,000 feet, some at 20,000 feet, some at 25,000 feet. As fighters burned through their fuel and returned to the carriers, new fighters were already spotted on deck, ready to launch. The combat air patrol was maintained continuously from dawn to dusk. This meant that at any given moment, Task Force 58 had 40 to 60 fighters airborne, not flying specific missions but simply maintaining station over the fleet, ready to be vectored toward any threat. This was inefficient by Japanese standards. It consumed fuel and pilot endurance without contributing to offensive operations. But it meant the fleet was never vulnerable. There was never a moment when the decks were empty, when an enemy strike could catch them unprepared. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Ozawa began launching his strikes. The process took time. Aircraft had to be brought up from the hangars, spotted on deck, engines warmed. The coordination between 9 carriers took additional time. The first raid 69 aircraft launched around 8:30 in the morning. It would take nearly 2 hours for all 4 planned raids to get airborne. Meanwhile, at 10:23 a.m., American radar detected the first raid 150 miles out. The report went immediately to the fighter direction officers in the combat information centers of each carrier. Within minutes, every fighter in the combat air patrol was being vectored toward the incoming raid. And more fighters were launching from the deck. This was the moment when American operational tempo proved decisive. The Essex-class carriers didn't suspend operations to prepare for defense. They didn't pull aircraft below to protect them from attack. They kept launching, more fighters to bolster the combat air patrol, more bombers in case scout planes located the Japanese fleet. The tempo didn't slow, it accelerated. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, commanding Fighting Squadron 2 aboard USS Hornet, an Essex-class carrier, received the vector from his fighter direction officer. Vector 290, Buster, fly west at maximum speed. He led his division of 4 F-6F Hellcats toward the contact. Behind him, more fighters were streaming off the deck. The Hornet alone launched 24 fighters in the 15 minutes after the radar contact. At 100 miles from Task Force 58, the Japanese raid encountered the first American fighters. What happened next was less a battle than a systematic destruction. The Japanese formation's 69 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, were flying in a coordinated formation, tight, disciplined, exactly as doctrine prescribed. They were met by 45 F-6F Hellcats, flying in loose, flexible divisions. The Hellcats dove from above, using their superior speed and the altitude advantage. They made slashing attacks, diving through the Japanese formation, firing, then zooming back up to altitude to repeat. The Japanese Zeros tried to engage, but the Zero, which had been revolutionary in 1941, was now obsolete. It was lightly built for maneuverability, with no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits from the Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns would set a Zero ablaze. The Hellcat, by contrast, was heavily built. It could absorb battle damage and keep flying, and it was faster than the Zero in level flight and vastly faster in a dive. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese raid, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. 27 broke through and flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from the screening cruisers and destroyers. 5 reached attack positions on the carriers. 1 bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing minor damage. 4 aircraft returned to their carriers. The second raid launched from the Japanese carriers around 10 a.m. 130 aircraft, the largest raid of the day. They were detected by radar at 110 miles. More American fighters launched. By now, the Essex-class carriers had over 100 fighters airborne. The second raid was intercepted at 70 miles. 98 aircraft were shot down. 32 reached the fleet. 7 got close enough to attack. All were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. None scored hits. The pattern repeated through the afternoon. A third raid of 47 aircraft was intercepted, 40 shot down. The fourth raid, 82 aircraft, lost 73 to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the day, a day that would become known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The numbers were staggering. Of 430 aircraft that the Japanese carriers had started the day with, 346 had been destroyed. American losses: 23 aircraft in air-to-air combat, and 6 to other causes. The loss ratio was 15-1 in America's favor. But these numbers only tell part of the story. The real story is what was happening on the carrier decks during this battle. Throughout the day, the Essex-class carriers maintained a relentless operational tempo. Fighters landed, were refueled and rearmed in under 30 minutes, and launched again. Pilots flew 3, 4, even 5 sorties in a single day. The flight decks never stopped moving. Aircraft were constantly landing, constantly launching. The tempo was sustained from dawn until dusk over 12 hours of continuous high-intensity operations. USS Lexington, an Essex-class carrier, logged 175 sorties on June 19th. USS Essex logged 182. USS Bunker Hill logged 168. These were not exceptional days. These were standard combat operations for Essex-class carriers by mid-1944. Compare this to the Japanese carriers. Ozawa's 9 carriers launched 4 major raids, totaling 373 sorties over the course of the day. The American 15 carriers, including 6 Essex-class ships, generated over 2,000 sorties. The Americans were generating combat power at 5 times the rate of the Japanese, from a fleet only 67% larger in carrier numbers. This was the revolution that Ozawa had not anticipated. Japanese intelligence knew the Essex-class existed. They knew roughly how many aircraft they carried. What they did not grasp was how fundamentally different American operational tempo had become. On the evening of June 19th, Ozawa assessed his situation. He had lost the majority of his aircraft, but his carriers were intact. He believed, based on Japanese operational assumptions, that the Americans must also be depleted. Both sides had fought all day. Both sides must be exhausted, their aircraft depleted, their crews at the limit of endurance. He was wrong. On the morning of June 20th, American search planes located the Japanese fleet. They were 275 miles away beyond normal strike range. Launching a strike at that distance would mean the aircraft would be returning after dark. Many would run out of fuel. Carriers had never attempted to recover large numbers of aircraft at night. Admiral Mitcher made the decision. Launch anyway. At 4:30 p.m., Task Force 58 began launching. 216 aircraft fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers from 11 carriers. The Essex-class carriers launched their full deck-load strikes in under 40 minutes. The attack force flew into the setting sun toward the Japanese fleet. They found the enemy at 6:40 p.m. 20 minutes of combat. The American aircraft sank the carrier Hio, damaged the carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda, damaged 2 oilers, and destroyed 65 more Japanese aircraft. Then they turned for home, flying east into the darkness, with fuel gauges dropping toward empty. What happened next demonstrated another aspect of the Essex-class revolution: adaptability under crisis. As the aircraft struggled back toward the fleet, many pilots radioed that they were critically low on fuel. Some were reporting 10 minutes of fuel remaining. 5 minutes. The fleet was still 70 miles away, 15 minutes of flying time. Pilots began ditching in the ocean as their engines quit. Admiral Mitcher made a decision that violated every principle of wartime operational security. He ordered every ship in Task Force 58 to turn on its lights. Running lights. Searchlights pointed vertically into the sky. Even the carriers, normally blacked out to avoid giving away their position, turned on their deck lights. The fleet became a beacon visible for 50 miles. Japanese submarines in the area could have targeted them easily, but Mitcher judged that saving his pilots was worth the risk. The aircraft found the fleet. Then began the most chaotic recovery operation in carrier aviation history. Aircraft approached from all directions. Fuel exhausted, pilots exhausted, many damaged from combat. They landed on whatever carrier they found first. Essex-class carriers recovered aircraft from other carriers. Light carriers recovered aircraft intended for fleet carriers. The normal pattern of each aircraft returning to its own carrier was abandoned. Any deck that was clear was an acceptable landing spot. 80 aircraft didn't make it back. Some ditched near the fleet and their crews were rescued. Some ditched far from the fleet and were lost. Some crashed on the decks during landing. It was the highest loss rate from a single strike operation in the entire war. But 136 aircraft recovered safely, and within 2 hours of the last aircraft landing, the Essex-class carriers had those aircraft refueled, repaired where necessary, and repotted on deck, ready for another strike if needed. The operational tempo resumed as if nothing had happened. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended on June 21st. Admiral Ozawa withdrew with his surviving carriers. He had started the battle with 430 carrier aircraft. He ended with 35 operational aircraft remaining. His trained pilots, irreplaceable after 2 years of attrition, were gone. The cream of Japanese naval aviation had been destroyed in 2 days, but the real story was the destruction of Japanese carrier doctrine itself. Ozawa had operated his carriers exactly as Japanese doctrine prescribed. He had positioned them for shuttle bombing. He had launched coordinated strikes. He had attempted the decisive battle that doctrine called for. Everything he did was correct by the standards of 1941. He was simply facing an enemy that had moved beyond those standards. The Americans weren't fighting by the rules of carrier warfare as the Japanese understood them. They were fighting an industrial war, where victory went to whoever could generate more combat sorties per day. Quality had been replaced by quantity. Precision had been replaced by tempo. The elegant coordinated strike had been replaced by waves of aircraft that never stopped coming. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Task Force 58, later wrote about the battle. The Japanese fought bravely. Their pilots pressed attacks with determination. But they were attacking a fleet that could launch aircraft faster than they could shoot them down. We didn't win by being braver or more skilled. We won by being faster. This was the essence of the Essex-class revolution. The ships themselves were impressive, large, well-designed, robustly constructed. But the real weapon was the system they embodied. A system of sustained high-tempo operations that treated carriers not as platforms for decisive strikes, but as factories that produced combat sorties, hour after hour, day after day, until the enemy was simply overwhelmed. The industrial dimension of this revolution cannot be overstated. By the end of 1944, the United States had 24 Essex-class carriers either in service or under construction. Japan had no fleet carriers under construction. American shipyards were producing Essex-class carriers faster than Japan could sink them. In fact, Japan wasn't sinking them at all. Despite repeated attacks throughout 1944 and early 1945, not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk. Several took severe damage. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs while operating off Japan on March 19, 1945. The bombs detonated in the hangar deck, setting off a chain reaction of explosions among armed and fueled aircraft. 724 crew members were killed. 265 were wounded. The ship's entire aft section was consumed by fire. Franklin survived. The open-sided hangar design, criticized by British and Japanese naval architects as vulnerable, proved to be her salvation. The explosions vented outboard through the open hangar sides instead of propagating through the ship. Damage control parties fought the fires for hours. Repair crews patched holes, shored up collapsed structures, and restored power. The captain, Commander Leslie Gueras, refused permission to abandon ship even when his executive officer recommended it. Franklin made it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. She was later repaired and modernized, though she never returned to combat. But the fact that she survived at all after damage that would have sunk any Japanese carrier demonstrated the fundamental robustness of the Essex design. This robustness was not accidental. It was designed into every aspect of the ship. The watertight subdivision was extensive. The damage control systems were sophisticated. The crew was trained relentlessly in damage control procedures. The open hangar allowed battle damage to be contained and repaired quickly. And crucially, the Americans had built a logistics system to support battle-damaged carriers. Service Squadron 10, attached to the Fast Carrier Task Force, included floating dry docks, repair ships, tender vessels, and crane barges. Essex-class carriers that took damage could be patched at forward bases like Ulithi Atoll and returned to combat within weeks, damage that would have required months of repair at a major shipyard. The Japanese watched this with something approaching disbelief. Carriers they believed they had sunk reappeared in combat weeks later. The intelligence reports seemed impossible, but they were accurate. The Americans had created a system of warfare where even severe damage was temporary, where losses could be replaced faster than they could be inflicted, where the tempo of operations never slowed because there was always another carrier, another air group, another wave of attacks. By early 1945, Japan's remaining carriers were immobilized in port, unable to operate for lack of aircraft and trained pilots. The Essex-class carriers, meanwhile, were conducting daily strikes against the Japanese home islands themselves. The final humiliation came on July 24, 1945, when aircraft from Essex-class carriers attacked the Kure naval base and sank or damaged every major Japanese warship still afloat, including the last remaining Japanese carriers. The official Japanese surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945, took place aboard the battleship USS Missouri. But ringing the Missouri in Tokyo Bay were 11 Essex-class carriers: Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Bonhomme Richard, and Shangri-La. They were silent witnesses to the end of the war they had done so much to win. The question posed at the beginning, how quickly can a carrier put aircraft into the sky, had been answered definitively. An Essex-class carrier could launch more than 100 sorties in an hour. It could sustain 200 sorties per day. It could operate continuously for weeks without returning to port, supported by the mobile logistics fleet that accompanied it. It could absorb battle damage that would sink other carriers and remain operational. And most devastatingly, it could be mass-produced 24 ships, built in less than a decade. This was the weapons system that Admiral Ozawa faced in the Philippine Sea. Not just ships and aircraft, but an entire system of industrial warfare that the Japanese could neither match nor counter. The doctrine that had served Japan so well in 1941 and early 1942 was obsolete by 1944. And the architects of that doctrine, the admirals and staff officers who had designed the Kido Butai and its operational procedures, could not adapt quickly enough to the new reality. The tragedy of the Japanese carriers was that they were magnificent ships operated by brave men according to doctrine that had been proven effective. But they were designed for the wrong kind of war. They were designed for decisive battles where quality and coordination would prevail. The Americans designed carriers for wars of attrition, where quantity and tempo would prevail. History is full of examples where qualitatively superior forces are defeated by quantitatively superior forces. The Essex-class carriers are the definitive example from naval warfare. They were not necessarily better ships than their Japanese counterparts in any single dimension. Japanese carriers had better armor protection in some cases. Japanese aircraft had better range. Japanese pilots, at least early in the war, were more experienced. But the Essex-class system, the ships, the operational doctrine, the logistical support, the industrial base that produced them, was overwhelmingly superior as a complete system. And in industrial warfare, systems defeat platforms, tempo defeats precision, volume defeats coordination. The last Essex-class carrier to serve on active duty was USS Lexington CV-16. She was decommissioned on November 8, 1991, 49 years after her keel was laid. She had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. She had operated propeller aircraft and jet aircraft. She had been modernized repeatedly, with angled flight decks and steam catapults and modern radar systems. And at the end, she was still operationally effective retired, not because she couldn't perform her mission, but because newer carriers had superseded her. 4 Essex-class carriers survive today as museum ships: USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York City, USS Hornet in Alameda, California, USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. You can walk their decks. Stand at the flight deck edge and look down the length of wood planking where thousands of Hellcats and Avengers rolled to launch. Descend into the hangar deck and see the open sides that made them vulnerable to weather but deadly effective in combat. Stand in the Combat Information Center, where fighter directors tracked raids on radar screens and vectored interceptors toward the enemy. They don't look particularly impressive today, dwarfed by modern nuclear supercarriers. The wooden flight decks seem quaint, the open-sided hangars seem primitive, but in their time, they were the most effective weapons platform in the world. They didn't win the Pacific War single-handedly, but they were the central instrument through which American industrial power was applied to carrier warfare, and in doing so, they changed naval warfare forever. The lesson the Essex-class carriers teach is not about technology. It is about systems and doctrine and the willingness to design weapons for the war you will fight rather than the war you wish to fight. The Japanese designed beautiful carriers optimized for the decisive battle doctrine they had refined over 2 decades. The Americans designed workmanlike carriers optimized for sustained attrition warfare. The Americans were proven right by history, but it took the Pacific War and the destruction of Japanese naval aviation to demonstrate which philosophy of carrier warfare would prevail. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.